Back 4 Blood was always going to have a difficult launch, given the weight of past failures, historical juggernauts, and the upcoming release of the highly anticipated Darktide. But nobody could have expected the game's launch to be such a disaster, with any potential the game had quickly going up in flames. Now, a little over a year later, the game has been left for dead, with the series' future in question, despite a series of updates that fixed just about every issue the game had, leaving an experience with a lot of interesting mechanics, replayability and progression. Unfortunately, nobody gave the game a second chance, and to understand why, we need to go back to 2015, to the release of Evolve. See, Turtle Rock's first game had come with a lot of hype and interest, with its unique asymmetrical gameplay promising hours of endless replayability, but the interesting concept failed spectacularly in the face of microtransaction hell and core design issues. Despite many attempts to recover, Evolve was abandoned in 2018. Now you may wonder why the heavily marketed, former developers of Left 4 Dead had chosen to pivot from their roots for their first game, but it wasn't surprising. See, the cooperative gameplay genre was stacked, with games like Killing Floor, Vermintide, Payday, and of course Left 4 Dead, which, despite strong competition, maintained a strong player count, with none of its competitors able to bring the same amount of humour, level design and world building Valve was known for, alongside the progression systems and graphics of a modern game. But by the time Evolve shut down, they were all beginning to show their age, and Turtle Rock saw an opportunity to release a game that was basically a sequel, and despite their previous failure, hype quickly grew, as Back 4 Blood was officially announced in March 2019. Now Turtle Rock have never been shy in using their link to Valve, but this game took it to new levels. I mean, from the characters to the setting to heck even the game's name, it was quite obvious what was coming, and with the blueprint right in front of them, and a decade of player feedback to work with, it was hard to imagine Turtle Rock screwing this up. Or so you'd think. As more information came out, hype slowly got replaced by frustration, even anger. No mod support, no offline progression, a season pass, and perhaps worst of all, no versus mode and a card-based progression system. Now I'm not going to claim to have played much if any of Left 4 Dead's versus mode, because I know the reputation it has, but I also know for many fans it's the soul of the game, and now the spiritual successor for it was shipping without it. For me, and I think a lot of other more casual fans, the card system was even worse. A AAA full-price game launching with a card-based progression system from a developer known for having previously had issues with microtransactions. I mean, even if there was no ulterior motive, card systems in general tend to mean either cash for progression or indie games. Not to mention, the Ridden designs looked awful. Of all the many mediums zombies have appeared in, the Ridden have got to be up there as the most boring looking designs. The main specials were a step up, especially the tall boy, but they are heavily inspired from other games, and I feel if you're going to borrow designs from other games, you might as well go all out and bring in some other cool ones. And if all that wasn't bad enough, the announcement of Darktide may very well have been the final nail. See, the Vermintide developers were finally moving to the bigger fantasy setting and bringing the heavy weapons with them, and it would be launching just weeks after Back 4 Blood. Still, Turtle Rock had the first launch and the first opportunity to convince players it was the superior game. Though as launch day approached, it was hard not to feel like the writing was already on the wall. Day 1 DLC, pre-order bonuses and an annual pass didn't exactly give the best first impression, and the early access alpha hadn't exactly been great. Back 4 Blood launched on the 12th of October 2021 and immediately went up in flames. To be fair, I wasn't expecting much, but the first few missions were surprisingly good. They had great pacing, character interactions and challenge that slowly built up until the finale on the ship, which threw out the usual defend an area set piece for a more hectic dive into the hordes, and then capped off with a gritty cutscene that's an absolute standout and had me wanting more. But that's about where the good stuff ends. See, they really did manage to screw up just about everything on launch. Just setting aside bugs, performance issues and glitches, there was a laundry list of issues here. The game's regular difficulty was incredibly punishing, and required more teamwork than you could possibly expect from randoms on launch day, which fair enough the community could adapt to eventually, if the special infected weren't such a nightmare, with basically all of them being bullet sponge tanks, and constantly spawning in, with either a bugged out or non-existent alert, so you could easily find yourself swarmed without realizing. Something that was made worse by the sheer amount of birds and car alarms in every map. It was pretty common to trigger a horde, then accidentally activate others from stray bullets or just trying to move away from the 10 armored tallboys that the game had spawned in. Add to that trauma damage that capped healing aggressively, and the regular difficulty on launch day quickly became a meat grinder. There was also no progression tracks for anyone who wanted to play offline or alone, which meant that even veteran players had to rely on friends or go through a gauntlet trying to clear the game with randoms. The card system didn't help here either. Giving players only a tiny slice of their full deck meant that the chances of surviving just the first few missions was complete RNG. If the game spawned in certain dark cards and you didn't have the right counters from the start, then it was pretty common for you to be unable to leave the first rooms. This also made deck building completely useless, as you needed damage stacking and trauma reducing cards, so the more you bought in the deck, the better your chances of getting them. Their versus mode replacement was also completely dead on arrival, and was such a flop it's honestly not even worth talking about. I'm also not sure what happened to the story, but after that initial sequence it basically goes out the window. Despite playing the game to completion a few times, I can't really tell you much about it, other than there's a general, a scientist and some kind of weapon. Really it sucks, and the characters themselves are much more interesting. But with the exception of Hoffman, they don't really have enough content to shine, but I'll talk more about that later. Now to their credit, Turtle Rock did patch the game, with the coming months bringing core fixes for just about everything, though not without some controversy, as popular builds like the Super Sprint and Infinite Melee builds were nerfed, before other balance changes to the game's difficulty were put through. Eventually though, even the progression system was overhauled, no longer limiting you to a slice of the deck, but instead letting you start with a complete one. But it was just too late. Despite Darktide also being a disaster, people just moved on, and the price tag and poor initial reception kept new players away. A lot of the changes that came to the game also never really made it into mainstream media, maybe due to a mix of the Evolve fiasco, the poor launch and a lack of versus mode. But there was definitely a vocal portion of the community happy to see the game fail. Which is a shame because the game today is honestly pretty good. After I saw the announcement of its support ending, I jumped back in for a bit and was pleasantly surprised. There's new special ridden, with unique animations and proper announcements, so you know they've spawned in. Dark cards have way more variety, with some really cool ones like Blackout and Hunger. The difficulties and bosses have also been rebalanced, though maybe a little bit too much. I would say from playing that Nightmare now is about the same difficulty as Launch Day Regular, maybe slightly easier, though this might be because the only players left are veterans who know what they're doing, so matches are generally pretty smooth. That said, there were still some glaring issues in both the base game and its expanded content that put me off wanting to stick around. While new guns and weapons were added, they all still feel the same and lack impact. I mean, that's not the most analytical point I've ever made, but just look at this. They all feel the same, and while nothing's bad, there's also nothing really interesting or memorable. The same can be said for the attachment system and equipment. Just compare them to the weapons from say Killing Floor or the equipment from Deep Rock, and you'll see what I mean. The campaigns are still very front-loaded, with basically nobody playing the later acts, which makes sense as the level design and mission variety really suffers in later acts. The game's color palette is also pretty boring. It's not bad, but most of the levels outside of the first few tend to blur together like this. And while there are some daylight missions, it's pretty clear the game's engine looks better at night. Their replacement versus mode was controversial pre-launch, ignored on launch, and then quickly abandoned. I get it wasn't popular, but there was basically no effort at all to update this mode into anything interesting. And between this and the useless hub area, I feel like the dev effort could have been used to add even a few campaign versus missions. This would have satisfied the vocal minority of Left 4 Dead diehards, and given another avenue to revive the game long term. There's also some ridden hives from the DLC, but they're terrible. Most of the players I played with went out of their way to avoid them, and for good reason. It's a showcase of all the worst aspects of the game's level and art design. I get the feeling that these were pushed out to satisfy DLC requirements. There are also new characters, but they suffer from the same issues characters did in the base game. There's too many of them, and too little content within each one. There's a reason most of the games in this genre have 4 defined characters, It's much easier to flesh them out. Instead, Turtle Rock tried to give something for everyone, without committing to truly customizable characters, and I don't think they succeeded. The same can be said for the card-based progression system. The change system is great, but it makes the use of cards pointless. They could have all just been perks. In the end, Turtle Rock took all the criticism and stigma of a card system, only to basically remove the unique aspects of it, which was the right decision, but again, had it just been perks there wouldn't have been any controversy about it. So what does the future hold for Back 4 Blood? I don't think it's gone for good, but any sequel will have a tough time competing with games like Deep Rock Galactic, which has emerged as a fan favourite. There's also Darktide, which will eventually be patched, and the IP alone will bring players back, and Arcane's Redfall is sure to be interesting. Yet despite all of this, I really do hope we see a Back 4 Blood 2. There's a lot of potential in the game, and with a sequel to bring more interesting levels, an expanded story, and campaign versus mode, I can see it doing well. But it's hard to say if Turtle Rock will be given a third chance.